At dinner, she called me Nina again like I was just another server. But the next night, her wine spilled when they announced my name as the new owner of the resort. Stick around because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's about reclaiming every room you were once told you didn't belong in. They used to call me the sweet girl, the kind who brought extra salad to dinner and stayed behind to clear plates while the other daughters-in-law sipped wine on the deck. But the truth? They didn't see me. Not really. Not even a little. Standing in the golden haze of sunset, the lake behind me glittering like spilled coins, I watched my mother-in-law, Darlene Caldwell, wave me off without meeting my eye. Nina, Ava, could you make sure the dressing's out this time? Last year, we had to eat salad like farmhands, she chuckled to her friends. The women around her, pearl earrings, manicured laughter, giggled politely. I smiled, nodded, and walked toward the kitchen. I wasn't the help. I was the owner. But none of them knew that. Not yet. Let's rewind. My name is Ava Mercer, 37, a systems engineer by training. I've spent the last 15 years building logistics models for regional transport infrastructure across the Pacific Northwest, boring stuff to most people. But I loved it. I loved the elegance of a well-run system, the grace of things that just worked, which ironically made me the complete opposite of the Caldwell family I married into. Ben Caldwell, my ex-husband, was the golden boy of the family, literature professor, Columbia grad, sensitive in a soft, intelligent way that once made me believe I had found someone who saw me. We met at a conference in D.C. He quoted Auden. I talked about sustainable railway design. It felt like balance. But when I first met his family, something changed. No, everything changed. They were wealthy, not loud about it. But the kind of generational wealth that seeps into the way someone passes a plate or expects a door to be open for them. His mother, Darlene, had the kind of smile that made you question your posture. His sister Lauren once told me my handbag looked very practical, the way a realtor might describe a basement that floods. I tried. God, I tried. I hosted holidays, learned their preferences, spent hours arranging charcuterie boards for brunches I was never thanked for. And still, I was background noise, a helpful extension of Ben, the girl who worked in tech or something, and who wore shoes from the wrong brands. They called me sweet, reliable, basic, never brilliant, never bold, never enough. But they didn't know what I was doing with my silence. They didn't know that while they were dismissing me at the dinner table, I was quietly building something far more permanent than their approval. 7 years into the marriage, I started investing through a small holding company I structured myself. My mother, Cecilia Mercer, cleaned motel rooms for most of my childhood and taught me how to stretch $1 so far it looked like 100. I took that lesson and added engineering precision. Every year, I took bonuses and contract margins and invested them into small hospitality ventures, boutique hotels, tiny lodges in mountain towns, and eventually, high-value properties. I did it quietly, deliberately, with the mentorship of Miriam Wu, a retired executive I met at a Women in Engineering Summit. Miriam saw me, the real me, long before I did. She helped me structure Clear Horizon Ventures. She called me relentless. And when a certain resort in Lake Haven came up for sale, the very same one the Caldwells had returned to every summer for 2 decades, she didn't even blink. You want to buy the place they think defines them? She asked, grinning. I nodded. You're cold, Ava, she said with a kind of admiration. I love it. We closed the deal through a shell acquisition, with me as silent majority stakeholder. I didn't need fanfare. Just control. I spent the next 6 months improving the property, staff wages, environmental upgrades, updated systems, ethical sourcing. Not because I wanted revenge. Not yet. But because I believed in building something that deserved to exist. And now here I was, standing in the same resort dining hall, wearing a linen sundress I'd bought on clearance, smiling at the family who never really saw me. Ben was somewhere on the patio, talking about a novel he'd never finish. His cousin Marcus had just asked if I could grab more napkins. And Darlene? She was explaining to the woman next to her that the help always forgot the details. The irony made my mouth taste metallic. Tomorrow, during the ownership summit, the manager would announce the new controlling interest in the property. My name would echo across the chandeliers and marble. Tonight, though, I was content to play my part. One last time. The invisible girl in the corner. The one who set the table. The one who now owned it. The night after the welcome dinner, I stood barefoot on the balcony of our room, holding a glass of wine I didn't really want. The lake was silent beneath a waxing moon, the kind of quiet that presses in on your chest instead of offering peace. Below me, I could hear them, the Caldwells, laughing by the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and gossiping about Tesla stock and who got their kid into the right kind of preschool. I could even hear Haley, Ben's cousin, tell a story about someone who tried to run a hotel without even understanding hospitality. Everyone laughed. The kind of laugh that forgets who might be listening. They didn't know I was the owner. They didn't even know I was a contender. But that wasn't what hurt. What hurt was that Ben didn't know either. He hadn't asked. Not once. Not when I started traveling monthly for work. Not when I stayed up late running performance reports and revising contracts. Not when I hired a property consultant and interior architect. In the 3 years since I'd started building Clear Horizons' hotel portfolio, Ben had never once asked what I was really working on. Because he didn't want to know.
He was a good man, yes.
Kind in the way people mean when they want to avoid saying passive. A good listener when it came to books, or ideas, or poetry. But when it came to me, really seeing me, he always looked slightly to the side like a man reading an article he couldn't quite finish. The truth is, Ben married a version of me he was comfortable with. Ava, the practical engineer. Ava, who didn't mind being the quiet one.
Ava,
who could fix the router and plan a weekend hike, but didn't disrupt the family dynamic. And I played along. For a long time, I tried to fit inside that frame. Until it broke. The breaking point didn't come with a fight. No slammed doors, no name-calling, no cinematic betrayals. It came one summer evening, right here, in this exact resort, at this same damn lake. Last year, Ben's uncle made a joke at dinner about me being surprisingly useful for someone who didn't come for money. They all laughed, a little too loudly, and Ben? He chuckled, then reached for the bread basket. I smiled. I always smiled. My jaw hurt for 3 days. That night, I lay in bed while Ben slept next to me, and I stared at the ceiling and realized I was done. Not angry.
Just done.
Done trying to earn approval from people who would never give it. Done shrinking myself into shapes that made others more comfortable. Done waiting for someone else to hand me a moment. So I built one. I made calls. I pulled capital from funds I'd been nurturing for years. I reviewed financial models, combed through ownership paperwork, conducted staff interviews under a pseudonym. When the resort's board signaled it was considering selling its majority shares, I flew to Chicago to meet with them in person. I wore a navy pantsuit and no makeup and explained my plan with bulletproof clarity. They signed the agreement 3 weeks later. The Caldwells didn't notice a thing. Why would they? I was just Ben's wife. The woman who brought extra sunscreen and knew how to fix the Wi-Fi. The woman Darlene once called unremarkably polite. The woman who didn't matter, except when someone needed something done. That invisibility had been a prison once. Now it was a weapon. In the months that followed, I made slow, careful changes. I improved the resort's security system, standardized employee hours, increased pay for seasonal staff, updated energy systems, and rerouted food sourcing through local sustainable farms. Nothing flashy. Nothing anyone like Lauren or Marcus would ever notice until it affected them. And tomorrow it would. The summit announcement was scheduled for after dinner. A few lines from the property manager, a press release embargoed until midnight, and then my name, my real name, attached to the thing they valued most. Not out of spite, out of truth. I hadn't told Ben because I wasn't hiding it. I just wasn't offering it anymore. If he wanted to know, he could ask. I turned away from the balcony and stepped back into the room. Ben was still by the fire pit, his laugh floating up through the window like smoke. I sat on the edge of the bed, and opened my laptop. There were final numbers to review, new hiring contracts to finalize, and a statement to approve. As I worked, I thought about my mother. Cecilia Mercer had raised me in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Portland. She cleaned motel rooms for 16 years and never once complained. She called hard work a kind of worship. She wore hand-me-downs with pride and taught me to do one thing better than anyone else. Pay attention. You watch how people treat the janitor, she said once when I was 10. That'll tell you who they really are. I watched. I watched Darlene sip $60 wine while talking about charity. I watched Ben's sister talk over waitstaff and smile too tightly when women of color walked by. I watched Ben, kind and quiet, fade away every time I showed ambition. Like he was trying to keep the peace in a room I was never invited into. So I made my own room. And tomorrow, they'd all be sitting in it, whether they liked it or not. The dining room that night felt like a scene lifted from a glossy lifestyle magazine. Crisp white tablecloths, flickering candles in glass hurricanes, laughter echoing off exposed wood beams. I wore a navy sheath dress and the same nude heels I'd worn to my college graduation, less for nostalgia, more for symbolism. Darlene wore pearls. She greeted me with a nod that was more dismissal than welcome. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, but then it never had. I took my seat at the edge of the table like always. Not at the head, never at the head. That belonged to her. Still did, at least for the next hour. The meal began with some story Ben's uncle was telling about a botched investment in a vineyard. I didn't care enough to follow the details. I stirred my soup silently, letting the voices wash over me like wind through trees. Then Lauren said, "Honestly, I miss when this place still had character. Back before they corporated up." "Oh, totally," Marcus chimed in. "You can tell some executive tech guy bought it and thinks he's doing something visionary. Probably calls himself a founder."
Ben left.
"Right? I heard the holding company running it now is trying to modernize everything. It's all just soulless now." I didn't flinch. I didn't sip my wine. I just let their words settle into the marrow of the moment. Ben didn't even look my way, didn't register the heat in my stillness or the irony bleeding from every syllable. His face was soft, relaxed, like a man who knew he was safe in his ignorance. Then Darlene raised her glass. "To families like ours," she said, "who've supported this resort for decades. We're not just guests, we're part of its identity." That was my cue. I stood, quietly, placing my napkin on the table. "Excuse me for a moment." No one paid much attention as I slipped out the side door and into the cool night air. My hands weren't shaking, not exactly, but my pulse drummed in my ears. I pulled out my phone and dialed Ethan. He picked up on the second ring. "You sure?" he asked. "I'm sure." "Copy that. We're announcing before dessert." I leaned on the stone railing outside the lodge and watched the lake. Its surface still like a painting. For the first time all day, I took a breath that didn't feel borrowed.
Through the tall windows,
I could see Ethan walk to the front of the room and tap his wine glass gently. The noise settled. Faces turned. I couldn't hear him, but I knew the script. We'd written it together. As part of our new ownership transition, we're honored to share that Clear Pines Hospitality Group has acquired full control of the resort.
And tonight,
We'd like to acknowledge the individual behind this transformation, our majority owner, Miss Ava Mercer. Inside, jaws dropped. I opened the door and walked in. The clack of my heels on the wood floor cut through the silence like a drumbeat. Lauren froze mid-bite. Haley's mouth hung open. Darlene's wine glass tilted in her hand until it spilled a slow crimson stain across the tablecloth. Ben looked like he'd been slapped with light. I made my way to the front of the room, steady and silent, until I stood where Darlene usually did, at the head of the table. I picked up the microphone Ethan had left behind. No cue cards. No notes. Just clarity. "Don't worry," I said, my voice calm and clean. "You're all still welcome here. Just like everyone else now." No one spoke.
no camp upgrades, no backdoor bookings.
No discounts for being a Caldwell. Not anymore. I smiled, handed the mic to the pianist, and walked out before anyone had the chance to manufacture applause. Outside, in the corridor lined with lodge photos and fake antique sconces, I let out a slow breath. My heels echoed behind me like punctuation. That was the moment it happened. The real shift. Not when they heard my name, but when they realized what it meant. That I'd been there all along. Building. Watching. Becoming. When I reached the end of the hall, I stopped in front of an old black and white photo of the resort from the 1940s. People in bathing caps, holding ice cream cones. No one looked like me. Tomorrow, I would begin redesigning this hallway. Replace the artifacts of entitlement with stories of the workers. The caretakers, the builders. The people who actually made this place run. But tonight, I just stood there, letting the quiet fill the space where my smallness used to live. I didn't need to see their reactions. I had become the thing they never imagined I could be. Unignorable. The next morning, the resort felt quieter. Like the walls themselves were holding their breath. But it wasn't real quiet. It was tension dressed up in politeness. I skipped the family brunch. Let them wonder where I was. Let them sit in that uncomfortable space between certainty and doubt. Instead, I walked the lakefront with Ethan, clipboard in hand. He updated me on the expansion project timelines, guest satisfaction surveys, and a plumbing issue in cabin 12. I nodded, noted it all, but barely heard any of it. My mind kept drifting back to the dining hall, to the exact moment they said my name. I hadn't gone back to the table. I didn't need to. The room had frozen in my absence, every relationship suddenly suspended in midair, like glass just before it shatters. By noon, the text started. First from Lauren. Hey, can we talk? Maybe clear the air? I left it on read. Then a knock.
Ben.
Of course. He stood in the doorway like a man approaching a stranger's home, unsure of his welcome. His eyes didn't carry anger. They carried confusion. That made it harder. Can I come in? He asked softly. I nodded and stepped aside. He sat on the edge of the armchair, like it might reject him. So, this is all true? I tilted my head. What part are you asking about? The ownership. The fund. The everything. Yes. He exhaled, staring at the floor. Why didn't you tell me? I studied him. The man I had loved for over a decade. Brilliant, kind, passive to a fault. The man who held my hand through grad school but never asked how I paid off my loans. Who bought me flowers but never asked why I worked weekends. Who loved the idea of me but not the weight of who I really was. Because you never asked. He blinked. I didn't think I needed to. Exactly. Silence spread out between us like a fog. I watched his chest rise and fall, the subtle panic in his breath. I wasn't hiding it to punish you, Ben, I said. I wasn't playing a game. I was just tired of explaining my worth to people who didn't want to understand. He didn't answer right away. Then finally a whisper. You blindsided me. I wanted to be cruel. I wanted to say, now you know how it feels. But I didn't. That wasn't the point. I didn't blindside you, I said quietly. You just weren't looking. He stood, walked to the window, stared out at the lake like it held answers. Maybe it did. Maybe they were just hidden beneath the surface like mine had been. I don't know what this means for us, he admitted.
Idoi replied.
He turned, eyes damp. So that's it. I think it's been it for a long time, Ben. We just didn't say it out loud. There was no fight.
No yelling. No melodrama.
Just a slow, inevitable unraveling of something that had been threadbare for years. He left with a soft click of the door. And I went back to work. That evening was the cocktail event for legacy guests, a formality from the previous owners I had debated canceling. Instead, I decided to repurpose it. I arrived just before the toast. The room buzzed with speculation. No one expected me to show. Or rather, no one knew what to do now that I was no longer optional. I stepped to the microphone. Good evening, I said. Some of you already know me. Some of you thought you did. A few awkward chuckles. I flipped to the first slide on the screen behind me, an aerial rendering of the resort's future expansion. New cabins, a wellness center, a dock for local youth programs. And all of this, I continued, is funded through a new initiative, the Caldwell Women's Fund. Darlene's eyes lit up. I saw it. She assumed it was her legacy. Her mark. I turned, looked her dead in the eye. It's named for my mother, Cecilia Caldwell. She cleaned motel rooms in Oregon for 16 years. Raised me alone. Taught me that respect is earned, not inherited. The smile fell off Darlene's face like a mask that no longer fit. And then, the final slide. Starting next season, we will be reviewing all private ownership partnerships, including long-term cabin lease agreements.
Gasps.
I didn't have to say it. They knew. Lauren's family cabin. Haley's rental wing. Ben's uncle's sweetheart lease. All of it. I smiled politely. We look forward to continued collaboration with all our guests on equitable terms. Then I stepped down and walked straight past them. Marcus tried to stop me. Wait, Ava, we should. You can book time with guest services, I said, without breaking stride. Just like everyone else. Back in my suite, I kicked off my heels and sank into the couch. My hands were trembling, not from nerves, but from release. 10 years of holding in my truth had built pressure behind my ribs like steam behind a steel wall.
Tonight it broke.
And I had never felt freer. The next morning, I didn't need to check my phone to know the messages were already waiting. I could feel the tension radiating through the resort like a low electrical hum.
I took my time getting dressed. No makeup.
No performance. Just me, in a linen blouse and flat shoes, ready to walk the grounds like I owned the place because I did. By the time I stepped into the lobby, the front desk manager greeted me with a smile and a small nod. Morning, Ms. Mercer. Morning, Danny. Everything good today? Breakfast rush was steady. Lauren Caldwell asked for her usual comped croissant. We let her know that's no longer a standing policy. I didn't smile. I just nodded. Thank you. Outside. The lake shimmered with late summer calm, but the energy in the common areas buzzed like a disturbed hive. Guests smiled tighter. Staff whispered behind clipped greetings. The Caldwells, those who were still here, tried to keep their voices low, but privilege has a way of leaking out. At noon, Lauren's voice memo arrived. Ava, hey. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We didn't know. Obviously, if we'd known. Anyway, let's chat? I'm sure we can figure something out. Family and all that. She'd used the word misunderstanding 5 times in 42 seconds. I let it sit. 20 minutes later, a formal email from Ben's uncle arrived, requesting a gracious extension on his lease arrangement. He attached an old invoice that still had the former manager's name on it, as if that could convince me of its legitimacy. The sense of entitlement was baked into every line. Then came Darlene's voicemail. Nina, sweetheart, Ava. I think things have gotten a bit dramatic, don't you? Really, this isn't you. You're not someone who holds grudges. You're thoughtful.
We've always respected that about you.
I think we should talk. Woman to woman. Family to family. I sat in my office, her voice still playing in the background as I opened a drawer. Inside, an envelope I had prepared the week before the reveal. Not out of revenge, but because some truths don't deserve to be buried just to protect someone else's comfort. It held printed emails, incident reports, 3 notarized statements from former staff, 2 housekeepers and 1 seasonal receptionist who had worked under Darlene when she acted like the resort was her second home. Or worse, her playground. She'd berated a young intern for bringing her the wrong brand of bottled water. Told another hostess she looked unfit for the front desk and suggested she lose a few pounds. She called one of them a mouthy little thing, in writing. I had settled all 3 complaints quietly after acquiring the resort. They didn't go public. I made sure the women were heard, apologized, improved hiring protections. But I kept the documentation. That afternoon, when Darlene arrived at my office wearing pearls and false humility, I let her speak for 5 minutes straight. About appearances. About how this might reflect on Ben. About how she knew I was a clever girl deep down, and that this behavior was beneath me. When she paused, waiting for me to validate her, I slid the envelope across the desk. She blinked. What's this? Just a few things I've kept on file, I said. In case your version of the story ever became too different from the truth. She opened the envelope, read the first page, and visibly paled. I'm not threatening you, I said gently. I'm just tired of people rewriting history to make themselves feel better. Her hands shook as she folded the pages back into the envelope. I could see the rage fighting with fear behind her eyes. But she said nothing. She left without another word. That night, I walked the grounds alone. For the first time in years, I felt rooted. The gravel didn't crunch with hesitation under my feet. The trees didn't whisper judgments. The stars above me didn't care about family politics. They simply were brilliant, untouchable, and unapologetically themselves. In the guest lounge, I passed a family I didn't recognize. The father stood up, holding his son's hand. Ms. Mercer, he said warmly, we just wanted to say thank you. This place has never felt so welcoming. His wife nodded. It's the little things, friendly staff, clean cabins, someone on site who actually seems to care. I smiled. Genuine this time. That means more than you know. Because that was what this had always been about. Not proving anything to the Caldwells. Not showing up Ben. Not even revenge. It was about creating something that reflected me. Something that could exist on its own terms, not because of inherited legacy, but because of earned care and intention. I returned to my suite, poured a glass of wine, and listened to the silence. No more pretending. No more minimizing. Tomorrow, I would meet with the resort staff again. Not as the invisible wife, but as the woman who rebuilt everything from the ground up. And the next day, I'd begin reviewing the family lease agreements one by one.
Fairly.
Transparently. With legal clarity and ethical purpose. Ben hadn't called again. I wasn't surprised. He wasn't cruel. He was just blind, and I was finally done standing in the dark beside him. 3 days after the reveal, Ben finally knocked on my door. I knew he would come, eventually. Not because he had something to say, but because he couldn't stand the silence. He stood there in a gray pullover and loafers. The same pair I bought him on a random Wednesday, when he forgot his own birthday. He looked like someone about to ask for a second chance, without knowing what he was apologizing for. Ava, he began. Soft, hesitant. Can we talk? I stepped aside, without speaking. Let him in. Let him feel the weight of the room. My room now. No photos of us. No traces of shared pasts. Just architectural drafts on the table and my laptop screen open to a proposal for a new lakeside yoga retreat for trauma survivors. He looked around, absorbing what he hadn't noticed for years.
This is yours, he said at last.
It always was, I replied. You just didn't look. He sat down on the edge of the armchair like it might bite him. I didn't know. I sat opposite him. That's the truth, Ben. You didn't. And you never asked. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I thought you liked being low-key. I do, I said. But not invisible. He flinched. That hit. Finally. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence was no longer a buffer. It was a boundary. And for once, I didn't feel the need to cross it first. I feel like I missed everything, he said. Not just the resort. You. You did. He swallowed hard. Do you still love me? I didn't lie. I think I loved what I hoped you'd become. He nodded slowly, eyes glassy but not crying. He wasn't a man of drama. But in that moment, he looked small. Not because I'd made him so, but because he never tried to grow. I don't hate you, I said. I'm not angry anymore. You outgrew us, he whispered, completing the sentence I couldn't. And that was it. The end of something that had never truly started the way it should have. A relationship built on assumptions, endurance, and soft silences that turned into hard truths. When he left, he didn't beg or protest. He just nodded. Like he'd finally heard what had been there all along. The next day, he checked out of the resort early. Left behind a folded note with a single line. Thank you for being stronger than I knew how to be. I folded it once and put it in the drawer beside the envelope I had once prepared for Darlene. Not because I wanted to remember him, but because I wanted to remember who I had become through the forgetting. That night, I walked through the dining hall just before the last dinner service. Staff smiled as I passed, some still adjusting to calling me Ms. Mercer instead of just ma'am. The energy had shifted, not because I demanded fear, but because I finally commanded clarity. I met with the head chef to discuss a new farm-to-table weekend series. I reviewed blueprints for converting the underused back lawn into a public meditation grove. As I walked back through the lobby, a little girl ran past me, chasing her younger brother. Their mother called after them, flustered and laughing. She met my eyes and smiled, breathless. "I'm sorry, kids," she said, sheepish. I smiled. "It's their resort, too." She blinked, realizing who I was. "Wait, are you?" I nodded gently.
Yes.
"I am." She laughed, delighted. "Good. You can feel the difference." I carried her words with me all the way to the dock. There, I sat cross-legged on the same bench where I'd once cried silently after being called sweet but basic. Where I had once memorized the sound of people laughing without me. Now, there was only the lake, still and wide and forgiving. I let my thoughts drift, not to Darlene or Lauren, or Ben, but to my mother, Cecilia Mercer.
She never got to see any of this.
But in some quiet, fierce way, she made all of it possible. I remember her hands, cracked from years of cleaning, steady as steel. She used to pack my school lunches with handwritten notes inside, always saying the same thing: "You're already enough." She never let me believe that silence meant shame, or that humility had to come with humiliation. So when I named the future fund after her, I didn't hesitate. The Cecilia Fund would offer scholarships for working-class girls in STEM. It would provide mentorship, financial literacy, and maybe, just maybe, the belief that quiet girls could one day own entire lakes. That weekend, we hosted the first community open day. Families came in from neighboring towns. A group of young veterans toured the upgraded cabins. Two sisters, barely teens, stood in awe at the smart sensor systems I'd helped design years ago. One of them turned to me and asked, "Did you build this?"
I did, I said.
"Cool," she grinned. "I want to build stuff too." And there it was. Not vindication, but legacy. And not the kind that came from being born into the right family. The kind you carve out, quietly, with grit and patience and spreadsheets and sleepless nights. The kind that didn't need a last name to matter. That night, for the first time in years, I slept with the windows open.
No ghosts, no guilt.
Just the lake, the wind, and the sound of something finally beginning. The week after Ben left, the resort finally felt like mine. Not just on paper. In spirit. Gone were the whispers behind my back. Gone was the need to shrink. The shadows where I used to disappear had been filled with purpose. And people, good people, were starting to see the changes. We rolled out the Clear Pines Community Access Program. Free weekend stays for families of frontline workers. Discounted packages for public school teachers. A rotating internship for underrepresented students in hospitality and engineering. When I stood in front of the staff to announce it, there were no forced claps. Only genuine, stunned silence, followed by the kind of applause that stays in your bones. Later that day, Clara, our head of housekeeping, found me on the south lawn. "Ma'am," she said, adjusting her clipboard, "I've been working at this resort 14 years. Never thought I'd see someone like you running it." "Someone like me?" I asked gently. She smiled. "Someone who knows what it feels like to be ignored, but doesn't stay bitter. You didn't just take over. You made space." I looked at her, really looked. A woman in her 50s. Her eyes weathered but strong, with hands that had carried the weight of others' comfort for too long. "I didn't take it to get even," I said quietly. "But I'm not afraid to be fair." She laughed. "Honey, that's more powerful than revenge." That weekend, we hosted our first wellness and reclamation retreat. 20 women showed up, each carrying their own silent war.
Divorced.
Widowed. Laid off. Forgotten. Some wore grief like armor. Some arrived already prepared to leave. We didn't sell them promises. We offered peace, movement, space. The sessions ranged from forest bathing to financial independence coaching. I led the one titled Designing Power, Quiet Engineering for Loud Impact. Halfway through the second day, one of the younger women, Allison, stood up during group reflection. She looked maybe 25, with tired eyes and a defiant mouth. "I thought this place was just another bougie retreat," she said. "But it's not. It's safe. And the fact that you're the one who owns it? It changes things." I thanked her, quietly. I didn't need to be the loudest voice anymore. My presence was doing the talking now. That night, as the sun dipped behind the lake, we lit floating candles, each one representing a piece of ourselves we were ready to release. Mine was silence. One morning, I took the long route through the guest cabins and ended up near the old Caldwell wing, the cluster of rooms Ben's family had once occupied every summer. Now they stood empty, except one, which we had leased to a nonprofit serving young adults aging out of foster care. I passed by just as a young woman was stepping out with a backpack and a planner in her hand. We nodded at each other, and she said, "Thanks again for the laptop program. I've already started my grant applications." "Good," I said. "This place is meant for that. For starts." She tilted her head. "You ever think about writing a book?" I raised a brow. "Why?" "Because whatever this is, it's a story people need to hear. Maybe one day," I thought. But for now, I was writing it in concrete and policy. That evening, I received a letter. A handwritten one. It wasn't from Ben or Darlene. It was from Cecilia Thompson, a guest who had visited the resort 20 years ago when it was still run by the previous owners. She had read an article online about the new changes, about the new owner. "I remember when I stayed here," she wrote. "The staff were polite, but you could tell they were just surviving. The place looked rich, but it didn't feel rich. Now, reading what you're doing, it finally sounds alive." At the end, she added, "P.S. If you ever build a library on the property, please consider naming it after someone who taught you to fight soft." I smiled. Maybe the Cecilia Mercer Library wasn't such a far-off idea. On Sunday, I met with the resort's legal team to finalize the contract terminations for legacy leases that had been quietly extended through back channels. We didn't do it with cruelty. We did it with documentation. Lauren's cabin? Reassigned to a nonprofit providing nature retreats to young girls from urban schools. Ben's uncle's unit? Converted into a family counseling annex for guests going through transitions. I offered to meet each former leaseholder personally. Only one accepted, Marcus, Ben's cousin. He showed up in boat shoes and a carefully ironed polo, clearly trying to keep things civil. "Look," he said, "I didn't always get you, but I get it now. You played the long game." "No," I corrected gently. "I built one." He blinked. "You all thought this place was a symbol of status," I continued. "But it's a system. And now it's mine. That means people matter more than legacy." He left quietly. That night, I stood on the balcony outside the owner's suite. It was the same suite where Darlene once demanded extra linens at midnight and scoffed at the thread count. Now, I stood there with a cup of chamomile tea and watched the moon ripple across the lake. This was no longer about proving anything. This was about remodeling inheritance, not the kind passed down, but the kind created. Not just for me, but for the girl who once made the salad, for the women who'd been overlooked, and for the daughters of housekeepers who might one day become owners. No fireworks. No grand gestures. Just slow, intentional change. And it was more than enough. 2 weeks after the retreat, an envelope arrived. It wasn't the type of letter I normally received, no return address, no branding, no fancy letterhead. Just my name in delicate cursive, almost too soft for the modern world. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed stationery. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from Grandma Rose Caldwell, Ben's grandmother, long past, but always the one Caldwell who treated me like I was more than invisible. It read, "Dear Ava, if you're reading this, It means the resort is in new hands. Perhaps yours. I always knew you were different, not because you were clever, though you are, but because you listen. Really listen. I never said much in those family gatherings. There wasn't room for someone like me anymore, but I watched. And I noticed how you carried your silence. Not with shame, but with discipline. Like someone waiting for the right moment. I hope when the moment came, you took it with both hands. This place, this family, they never knew how to hold a woman like you. But that doesn't mean you weren't worthy of being held. And if by chance, this letter reaches you after you've taken ownership, I want you to know, I'm proud of you. Not just for what you've built, but for how you never let their ignorance define your value.
Keep going.
Rose. I sat with the letter for a long time, letting every word melt into the cracks they'd left behind.
She had seen me.
Back then, when I didn't even know how to see myself fully. Sometimes, you don't need validation from the whole world. Just one voice, rooted in quiet love, is enough to shift something tectonic. That night, I framed the letter and placed it in the newly renovated staff library. Beneath it, I added a small plaque. For every woman who has ever been asked to smile quieter. A few days later, I got a message from Ben. He wanted to visit. Just for a walk, he wrote.
No agenda. No arguments.
I debated. We hadn't spoken since the day he moved out.
No legal fights, no drama.
Just silence. Respectful, perhaps. But silence, nonetheless. I agreed, and we met at the lakeside path just after sunrise, where the fog still clung to the water like regret. He looked older. Tired. Not in the way people age from stress, but in the way people change when they realize the scaffolding they leaned on wasn't as sturdy as they thought. I didn't come to ask for anything,
he said first.
I came to listen. For once. I nodded, and we walked slowly, our footsteps crunching on gravel and pine needles. Why didn't you tell me, he asked eventually, about the resort, about the fund, about all of it? I paused. Because I spent a decade telling you smaller things and you never asked more. He nodded, quietly absorbing it. I didn't know how much I didn't see. He admitted. Not just about you. About the systems I live in. That's the thing, I said. You don't have to be cruel to participate in erasure. You just have to be indifferent. He stopped walking. I was comfortable, he said. And your discomfort didn't interrupt that. Until it did. We stood in silence for a moment. The kind that carries weight, but not hostility. I'm proud of you, he said softly. It didn't land like a rescue. It wasn't meant to. Thank you, I replied. But I'm not doing this to be proud of. I'm doing this to breathe. After Ben left, I walked the long trail around the back of the resort, toward the cabins that now housed our community scholarship students. There I saw her. A young girl, maybe 17, sitting on the steps with a sketchpad. Hi, I said gently. Mind if I sit? She shook her head. We sat in silence for a while. She kept sketching. What are you drawing? I asked eventually. She turned the pad toward me. It was the main lodge, but not as it was. As it could be. With solar panels, community murals, accessible gardens. You see things different, I said. So do you? She replied. They told me you used to be invisible, that you own it now. I smiled. That's mostly true. She tilted her head. Was it worth it? I thought about it. About the years of biting my tongue. The resentment. The aching to be heard. The solitude. And then I thought about the retreat. The letter from Grandma Rose. The expansion plans. The girl in front of me. Yes, I said. It was worth everything. She smiled, tucked her sketchpad into her bag, and walked off toward class. I stayed seated a while longer. The path I had taken hadn't been a straight line. It twisted through silence, injustice, compromise, and quiet revolution. But here, in this place I had reclaimed, I could finally see the full shape of it. This was no longer about revenge. It was about rewriting the blueprint for who gets to belong. The scandal didn't start as a scream. It came as a whisper. A quietly forwarded email. A blurred screenshot. A sudden change in the mood of the staff. And then the headline. New resort owner linked to insider dealings and conflict of interest in property acquisition. It hit just as Clear Pines was preparing for its first community wellness summit, an event Ava had designed to bring in nonprofit leaders, youth mentorships, and alumni from the Women's Investment Initiative. Instead, she spent that morning on the phone with legal counsel, PR advisors, and her accountant, trying to put out a fire she hadn't lit. The article was light on facts, but heavy on tone. It insinuated that Ava had used confidential information from her former engineering clients to fund hotel acquisitions, that the structure of the holding company was suspiciously evasive, that her background lacked the pedigree expected of resort ownership at this level. They didn't say the word gold digger. They didn't have to. The implication clung to every line. It took Ava less than a day to figure out the source. Lauren, Ben's sister, still bitter, still watching. She hadn't taken well to the loss of her discounted cabin lease. And apparently, she hadn't forgiven Ava for turning down her request to collaborate on a legacy branding campaign she believed the resort should run. Ava could practically hear her voice. You know, just to make sure the Caldwell name doesn't fade. Instead of fading, the name had detonated. Lauren had found a disgruntled former contractor, someone Ava had once fired for falsifying permit documents, and fed him to a local tabloid. The man had spun a web of half-truths, and the publication, hungry for class drama and gendered scandal, had run it without verification. It was meant to humiliate her. But Ava was no longer in the business of humiliation. She was in the business of truth. By day 2, the whisper had become a storm. The board of directors from one of the scholarship partner programs emailed requesting clarification. A group of seasonal employees asked if their jobs were in jeopardy. Her own assistant, a brilliant woman named Kayla, hesitated outside her door before saying quietly, "You should say something. Not just to them, to all of us." That night, Ava called a town hall. Not just for the staff. Not just for the media. For the public. She held it in the main lodge. Stripped of chandeliers and white linens. Just folding chairs and a mic. Nearly 200 people showed up. Staff. Former guests. Investors. Students.
Locals.
And in the back, Lauren, arms crossed. Lips thin with expectation. Ava stepped up to the mic without makeup, without a script, wearing the same charcoal gray sweater she wore on site walkthroughs. Nothing curated. Nothing performative. "My name is Ava Martin," she began. "And no, I didn't grow up in resorts like this one. I grew up watching my mother juggle 3 cleaning jobs. I learned about trust funds when I was 26 and auditing one for a project proposal. I didn't inherit this resort. I bought it."
She paused.
"And now someone wants to question how I got here." She held up the article in her hand. A single page, folded neatly. This is what power does when it's scared. It rewrites the story. It whispers doubt. It throws shade and expects women like me to shrink under it. A hush fell over the room. But I'm not here to fight rumors. I'm here to offer proof. From the side of the stage, Kayla wheeled out a cart stacked with binders. "I've brought full records, tax filings, investment structures, acquisition timelines. You're welcome to review them. And I've asked a third-party audit firm to publish a report in the next 10 days. Because I believe in transparency, not performance." A beat. More importantly, I believe in this resort. Not as a backdrop for the privileged, but as a stage for transformation. She scanned the crowd. "We have kids here who have never stayed anywhere with indoor plumbing. And now, they're learning to kayak, to code, to lead." Ava's voice didn't shake. It rang. "If this makes some people uncomfortable, that a woman without pedigree, owns the table now, good. Growth is uncomfortable. But I won't apologize for it." She let the silence stretch. "Some of you came tonight hoping I'd beg for understanding. I won't. Others came hoping I'd inspire you. That's not my job. I'm not here to be palatable. I'm here to be possible." A standing ovation didn't follow. But what did happen was more powerful. People began clapping, not in performance, but in solidarity. It started from the back. One of the scholarship mothers, then a staff chef, then a retired veteran who volunteered as a groundskeeper. The ripple grew slowly, honestly. Even some of the guests who had whispered her name like a scandal days earlier joined in. Lauren left before the applause ended. Later that night, Ava stood alone in the staff kitchen, breathing in the scent of lemon oil and rosemary from the after-summit meal. Kayla stepped in, holding a folder. "They're already walking back the story," she said. "Another outlet just ran a piece defending your work with local nonprofits." Ava took the folder and smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for the headlines," she said. "But I'll take the correction." Kayla hesitated, then said, "I think you did something more important tonight." "What's that?" "You reminded people that integrity isn't loud, but it's real."
Outside.
The lights of the lodge reflected across the lake. The ripples spread like the consequences of courage. This wasn't the end of Ava's journey, but for the first time, she knew the story she was writing couldn't be unwritten. Not by whispers. Not by legacy. Not by anyone who thought power was something inherited rather than earned. I didn't expect peace to feel like this. It wasn't fireworks or champagne. It wasn't some cinematic moment of standing on a mountaintop, arms raised in victory. It was quieter, deeper, like the hum of something settling inside me after years of being rattled loose. The morning after the town hall, I took a walk alone by the lake. It was early, barely past 6. Mist still clung to the water's surface like the resort was holding its breath. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for anything. Not criticism. Not judgment. Not the subtle jabs hidden in compliments. Not the performative smiles at family brunches. Not even Ben's silence. Just stillness. There's a difference between silence imposed on you and silence you choose. This was mine, and I had earned it. I thought of my mother, Cecilia Martin, motel cleaner, single parent, soft-spoken, sharp-eyed. The woman who taught me how to patch drywall and balance a budget before I ever learned how to flirt or take a day off. She used to say, "You don't have to speak loudly to make yourself heard. You just have to speak truth." That's what this had always been about. Not revenge. Not even vindication. But truth. A week later, I received a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter, handwritten on thick stationery in a formal cursive I immediately recognized. Darlene. She didn't apologize. Of course not. But she did say this. "I underestimated you. I assumed silence meant smallness. I see now that I was wrong. And while we may never see eye to eye, I won't insult us both by pretending you didn't earn what you have." I folded the letter slowly, thoughtfully. It wasn't closure, but it was acknowledgement. And that was more than I ever thought she'd give. A day later, Ben emailed me. Just one line. "I'm sorry I never saw you. I wish I had asked." I stared at the words longer than I cared to admit. There was a time when that line would have undone me. A time when I would have begged for it, prayed for it. Now, I wished him peace. But I didn't need his seeing to make me visible anymore. The summer rolled on. Construction began on the wellness center, and the first wave of interns arrived for their training program. I sat in the back of the room as they introduced themselves. Young women from underserved schools, single-parent households, scholarship paths I once knew too well. One girl, around 19, stood up nervously and said, "I never thought someone like me would end up somewhere like this." I smiled, because that was the point. This wasn't about making the Caldwells pay. It never truly was. Their dismissal of me had been the spark, but the fire had always been lit by something deeper. The desire to build something no one could shrink me out of. The dream of turning invisibility into impact. The belief that someone, somewhere, would sit in a room I built and say, "I belong here." At the annual resort gala, that fall, I stood before a crowd of donors, staff, community leaders, and former skeptics. I wore the same navy dress from the family dinner, the one Darlene once called practical. This time, it was powerful. I stepped up to the podium and took a breath. 3 years ago, I stood in this very room as someone you overlooked. You knew my name, but not my story. You saw my smile, not my spine. There was a ripple in the crowd. Some laughter. Some lowered gazes. And that's okay. We all see what we're trained to see. But I'm here to change the training. I pointed toward the back, where the new interns stood clapping shyly. They are not just students. They are architects, founders, future owners of rooms like this. Another beat. And I'm not asking for your approval. I'm inviting your participation. Let's build spaces that don't just tolerate difference, but recognize it as strength. Applause rose.
Full. Honest.
And this time, it wasn't reluctant. It was earned. On the final day of the season, I walked the lake trail alone. Leaves had begun to turn, gold and red curling at the edges of the path like nature was painting the year closed. I paused by the water, breathed, reflected. There had been so many versions of me. The quiet wife, the overlooked daughter-in-law, the girl who didn't come for money, the woman who didn't take up space. But here now I was none of those. I was the owner, the builder, the woman who stayed silent not out of fear, but precision. And then chose to speak. Not to shout, but to shift something. The legacy I was building didn't come from a family name. It came from reclaiming my own. Final words. To anyone who's ever been underestimated, who's sat at a table feeling unseen, know this. You don't have to wait for permission. You don't have to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. Build your own damn table. Sit at the head. And if they call you just a maid, make sure the next time they show up, they're paying full price to enter your house. Because the quiet girl who made the salad, she owns the kitchen now. And she sets the menu. And that's power.